On December 7, 1941, military forces of the Japanese Empire attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Now, that was a disaster for the American military, but just off of Pearl Harbor, an American destroyer called the USS Ward sank a Japanese submarine. The shots were fired by this gun. The Ward's deck gun was staffed by naval reservists from St. Paul, Minnesota, and the deck gun is actually in St. Paul now. It's actually aiming at the Minnesota History Center, which you've already visited in past and presents. We're here, though, at the very south end of the Capitol Mall. So this is St. Paul's state capitol, and we're going to visit some sites that are memorials on the Capitol Mall in this episode of Past and Presents. We'll start a tour of memorials by the state capitol in front of the state capitol. This is the very famous Minnesota state capitol designed by Cass Gilbert. And this is the newest and largest of the war memorials on the Capitol grounds. This is the World War II Veteran Memorial for the state of Minnesota. Over 300,000 Minnesotans served in the Second World War between 1941 and 45, and about 2% of them died in the conflict. You should come visit this for yourself to really take it all in. It's a very spacious memorial with a lot of meaning embedded. Generally, the theme is one of moving from darkness to light, from despair to hope, and you actually get a sense of kind of moving upwards along a plane. You also get these panels around that explain the history of Europe and the Pacific, and the home front as well. You also see that the memorial is surrounded by what's called the Ring of Honor. That has stone plaques representing lots of other wars, Spanish-American, Civil War, World War I, but also specific units, people who were on the Bataan Death March, women who served, Hispanic Minnesotans who served. So there's a lot to explore here if you do come down to the state capitol. I'm interested in memorials partly because there's something both secular and sacred about them. We live in a country that separates church and state, and yet at the same time we do have these very holy places where we celebrate the sacrifice of wartime. And that's maybe as good an entree as we can do to lead into our conversation that will start this week and continue into our next webisode. And that's on how is it that Christians practice history? So this will be an extended conversation with our faculty. We'll have lots to say about this in class as well, and you'll be writing about this. But let's kick it off and go to our first part of our conversation. So in this week's conversation, AnneMarie, Kooistra, and I are going to be wrestling with actually, it's going to take 2 weeks, I think. How do Christians do history? Now,
I'll be wearing the same clothes, but don't let that fool you.
Just it might be two separate filming things. We just might be on a rotation where we wear the same clothes. I might take this off just to in Tracy McKenzie's book, he suggests that the task of a class like this is to help students at a college like Bethel, or in his case, Wheaton, think historically about the past, but also think Christianly about the past. Now, for the most part, we have not necessarily brought faith explicitly into the class at this point, and here we're going to do this. But let me start with this. To what extent is thinking historically about the past and thinking Christianly about the past exactly the same thing?
Well, I think it's very similar in that if you are a good historian, you will engage in the same kinds of practices that a historian engages in. So if I'm doing a good history of prostitution, it's probably going to look very similar in terms of the evidence I use, the secondary sources I use in order to create my piece. So it will look very similar.
I mean, I'll come back to this in our second segment for this week. But a book that I think has really been helpful to me is George Marsden. Marsden's a Reformed historian, taught at Calvin, taught at Notre Dame for a long time, trained a lot of great American religious historians. And he suggested, mostly for a secular audience, you really don't have anything to worry about. We actually play by the rules of the game. And so he talks about the fact that we abide by rules of evidence, and we are seeking to be objective. And a way I sometimes have students think about this, and so I'll frame it as a question to you. If someone were to read an article you've written or a book you're writing about the history of prostitution in California, like 1888, would they know that you were a Christian?
Well, funny you should ask, because I had students in history of sexuality read an article that I'd written, and I asked, can you tell that I'm a Christian by reading this article? And a lot of them said, if I didn't know you, I wouldn't necessarily be able to tell, except that a couple of very perceptive students, I thought, noted that I don't necessarily have the sort of celebratory tone that some of the historians who look at this have. Instead of saying, oh, let's just look for agency on the part of these women who are, fighting the system by using the system's parameters against the system. I'm more willing to say, this was not a great system for women, and sort of acknowledge that they weren't just agents.
Okay, and now actually I want to come back to that maybe in the second half of this, because I think it is one place where Marston, for example, does say there might be some assumptions you want to push back against on the basis of your faith.
Right, and most students did not notice a very discernible
It's very
Christian.
subtle.
Yes, it's very subtle,
Yeah.
and I do that deliberately, actually.
It could vary by field, too.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, the nature of the history I've done recently, as opposed to my graduate training of diplomatic history.
Right.
If you had read articles I did in grad school or my first couple years,
Right.
you would, I don't know if you'd ever think.
No.
When I've done book reviews, the one place that might slip in is I've reviewed books about the Cold War, and I suggest maybe you're not being attentive enough to religion.
Right.
And maybe you don't know what to do with those categories. But it might be a little different if you're doing the history of Christianity, and that's really tricky. And I'm not trained as this, but talking to some evangelical historians who do evangelicalism, on the one hand, they want to be detached.
Right.
They want to do the best quality work they can. They want to be respected within their guild. I think they also have at least some sense they're doing it for the church.
Right.
It's at least a helpful criticism for fellow evangelicals.
Right.
So when I do history of Bethel and history of pietism, I sometimes feel like I'm getting into that area, which can be tricky.
Right, but it's also interesting to know, and I think George Marsden has acknowledged this. I'm not sure in this piece, but in another one, that one of the best historians of Puritan New England is actually a non-Christian. So
Harry Stout.
no, it's Percy.
Yeah. Okay.
So anyway,
so an atheist could write the history of Puritanism
and do it very well,
Right.
even if he's maybe not as attuned to certain sort of facets of the Puritan culture. So you're not necessarily a Christian because you're doing Christian history.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I actually just read a piece by the president of Wesleyan University in Connecticut, who's an intellectual historian. He describes himself as a atheist secular Jew. He has a kind of cultural component. But he wrote this piece for the Wall Street Journal last week talking about bringing religious questions into his intellectual history classroom and asking people, don't just tell me what original sin means in Christian theology, but how would it feel to be a Protestant in the 16th century? And he says that he thinks it's a really important question to ask, not to convert these students, but to develop empathy and to help them take these people on their own terms. But his students are really uncomfortable with it, including those who are Christian, because it's a very hard thing to talk about in the kind of secular marketplace of ideas sometimes.
Well, and what's also sometimes challenging for Christian students who are learning about history is to sort of expose them to this idea that the Christians they read about from, say, 17th century American history are very different in their articulation of the faith. They read Mary Rowlandson, for example, and she's writing about Native Americans, and they're like, whoa, this, God the Father business, this, retribution business, this wrath, that's very weird, for them to read that is in fact a fellow traveler.
One of the things I'm most excited about in teaching the modern Middle East is the fact that in order for it to be modern, we have to really be focused on current events. That I want students to recognize that history is a living, breathing thing, that not only are they a part of it, but that it's being shaped all of the time. So particularly with the study of the Middle East, this is what's dominating current events every day. Kemal Ataturk is a fascinating figure that actually kind of serves as a, his story provides this broader narrative to really even understanding the struggles of creating a modern Middle East and how the Middle East interacts with the rest of a global society. At the same time, it's fascinating to look at, and we will do this, things like the Iraqi national soccer team, the Iranian national soccer team. So I think that sports is such a huge part of Middle Eastern history and part of national identity, and understanding things like religious divides, understanding gender inequity, and also places where gender boundaries really get pushed, which is a huge theme in the course. So as much as I'm excited to focus on sort of big figures, I'm also excited for us to really actually be following soccer teams and cricket teams and things like that to sort of see how those both unite and then also divide people, but how they're representative of a lot of these other societal issues.
We're now at the Korean War Memorial for the state of Minnesota. This is just a little bit east of the World War II Memorial on the state capitol grounds. This is dedicated in 1998, and in many ways it's my favorite, I think the most interesting memorial. The Korean War is kind of this forgotten war, but almost 100,000 Minnesotans served in it between 1950 and 1953, and almost 1,000 of them were either killed or went missing in action. Another 1,500 were wounded. So you get this really interesting sculpture of a young GI who's been separated from his platoon, is kind of lost in the wilderness, gazing off. And if you read the inscription, it talks about him having grown too old too quickly, and suggests some of the haunted nature of the soldier's experience in a war like Korea. We'll come back and look at a couple more memorials later on, but now let's hear from a different kind of history department person. We're going to talk to some of our teaching assistants now.
Why am I a history major? That's a good question. Well, when I came to Bethel, I was going to be a physics and engineering major, and then I realized quite quickly that there's something about that framework of doing work that I didn't like.
It's something I actually didn't come into Bethel with, was a history major. I was psych and English, and I just loved reading and I loved understanding how people thought. But when I was away from history, I realized I loved history for the reasons that it really included both of those things, and it was just a world to really explore.
I realized I really liked history in high school, and I had a great ILA professor, Jim Ferreira, who's gone now, but thank you, Jim. Jim, and then Dave Broza, who is the career development and calling guy. Those two people gave me permission to look to something in the humanities, because they told our class that if you're looking for a major that will be a direct ticket to a job, you're not going to find a whole lot of majors that have the career designation written in the title. And I thought, wow, that's really good. I got to believe that these guys are right, because they know what they're talking about. They've lived it. And they said, you got to think about your studies, your time at Bethel as more than that. This is about more than just getting a ticket to a job. Basically, they said, the best advice we have is study something you know that you'll enjoy for 4 years. I thought, okay, I know what that is. I enjoy history. I'm going to study for 4 years, and we'll see what happens.
Being a double major has been, it's a full plate, but it's worth it, especially going into education and being interested in getting today's students interested in social studies. I think that sometimes the field is overlooked with the emphasis on STEM, but I don't think it's recognized how important it is to developing the future citizens of the United States, or anywhere even, just to understand social studies and history particularly. How did we get to be where we are today? How can we build something that's better than what we've had, that's more equitable and just treats people better than we have in the past? That's what I've come across from a lot of American history studies, is that yes, we've succeeded in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of ways that we've hurt a lot of people along the way. And I think in order to build a society where we consider those people better, history is essential.
Trust people that are in the corporate world. Most of the people I've talked to, even after Dave and Jim gave me their advice, most of the people I've talked to have said, you know what, most of the people I hire are doing something that has nothing to do with the major that they had in college. And so I think of my history studies as, okay, I'm preparing to analyze situations, figure out what problems are, solve problems, think critically, and then present that information and present viable solutions. And also coordinate and work with people. And those things are all things that you're doing every day in the corporate world.
My studies at Bethel have really encouraged me to want to pursue further education, but with going into education, I want to kind of delay that a bit and get some experience first. So I've kind of found a middle road by applying for a Fulbright scholarship. I'm hoping that that will lead to something kind of promising down the road, but that was just a good opportunity to both teach and be involved in studies in another country. So I'm really excited for that, and I'm waiting to hear back on that. And if that doesn't happen, then I'll probably teach for a couple of years and then consider going to grad school once I kind of have a better understanding of what I would like to pursue specifically.
I became a teaching assistant in the fall of my sophomore year. I was just starting some TA work with Sam Mulberry for CWC, and then Dr. Gehrz asked me if I'd like to help out in the history department, which I said yes. And really it's just been a very good experience. all the people in our department are really wonderful. All the TAs and professors are great people to work with, very creative people.
How I became a TA was I had first been a TA for another class, and I had had a class with Professor Magnuson, and she thought I did quality work, so she's like, would you be interested in being a TA? So I said, sure, why not? I'd love to just kind of get connected with the department more, and I've really enjoyed the work I've gotten to do. It's especially for going into education, I've gotten a lot of practice with grading papers and meeting with students and kind of conferencing with them as they work on papers for Dr. Magnuson's classes.
For me, the most beneficial and the most fun thing has been getting to work with everyone in different aspects. So we've coordinated a couple of events for the department. We had a fall get-together with hot dogs and games and s'mores around the campfire at Sam Mulberry's house. That was really fun.
Besides the technical aspect, it's a lot of fun. We have really solid people in the department, so getting to work with them on projects for the department is always a blast. We've recently decorated the board, and that was a project how we got to work together on that and just enjoy spending time with fun people, but also feeling good about accomplishing something in the meantime.
Defining experiences for me have probably been actually fairly recently in senior seminar. I think getting to that point and realizing, wow, I've spent a whole semester researching this thing, and now I'm writing a very lengthy paper, the longest one I've written in my life, and realizing that it turned out okay. For me, that's pretty amazing to see, okay, this is the culmination of all those years of study. So I've really enjoyed working with our small group of 4 people in senior seminar, and just really getting down to what does it mean to do research and to create something original. So that's been the most exciting experience for me. It's just the senior seminar process. It's very fun stuff.
Well, there's lots of moments that define, I think, the different aspects of the history major at Bethel, particularly how do we use the past as a way to grow in our faith and glorify Christ. There's a lot of different experiences that really contribute to that, but a lot of it has come from sort of exploring the concept of intellectual humility. I see this a lot in a lot of your classes, Dr. Gehrz, when we look into the past as a foreign country and understanding how you can't really master it. You just go into it and you explore and you take notes and that's it, but you never have the whole concept completely nailed down. And I see this in a lot of Dr. Magnuson's classes too, and Dr. Poppinga's classes when you're exploring places that are different. In American history, whether it's looking at minorities, such as the Native American groups with Dr. Magnuson, or looking at Muslims in America today with Dr. Poppinga's classes. You just really get to encounter this aspect of you are not yet arrived, you never will arrive, and you just need to approach all study with a sense of I'm going to take what I can and just try to apply it in a way that is constructive.
I think if there's one word students attach to modern Europe, it's empathy. And that might seem strange. How different are Europeans than Americans? It's kind of the same thing, just colorful money and different ways of plugging in your iPad, right? But I think it doesn't take long in the semester to realize that there is a real imaginative leap, that these are moderns, but they're not quite the same. We start with 18th century French peasants who tell stories to scare their children, and workers who torture cats. And before you know it, we're in the Victorian age with a frustrated housewife who feels trapped and confined in a life that has very few opportunities open to our women students. By the end of the 19th century, we're talking about a young French student who becomes an anarchist, throws a bomb into a cafe, and before you know it, it's the 1940s, and we're in the forests of Poland with the ordinary men of Christopher Browning's book, German military police reserves who are killing Jews as part of the final solution. And we have to, by then, ask ourselves, what do we have in common with these people? What brings them to that point? What makes them European? What makes them modern? And so I think it's a real stretching thing that students might not expect, but a deeply transformative process too. And it leaves you with this capacity maybe to imagine the world as other people see it, and maybe to live with some of the complexity we encounter in the modern age of European history. So it's my favorite class to teach. I've done it since I've got here, and hope I see a lot of you in the class.
This is the Minnesota Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This was dedicated in 1992, and at first glance it's somewhat evocative of Maya Lin's famous memorial in Washington, D.C. It's very stark as you look at the Roll of Honor with the quotation from the poet Archibald MacLeish. 68,000 Minnesotans served in the Vietnam War. 1,100 of them died, and that's actually integrated into the memorial in a really interesting way. If you look at the floor of the space, you'll find 68,000 little square tiles, and 1,100 of them are colored green and scattered around to indicate the degree of which Minnesotans lost their lives or went missing in action. Vietnam, of course, is this deeply controversial war. Even in 1992, there were some deep wounds there. And if you read the history of this memorial, you get the sense that they want it to be as apolitical as possible. They actually said at the first dedication ceremony, we're not trying to resolve political disputes, we just want to remember. And the chief way they tried to do this was through conjuring the notion of coming home. A really interesting part of the memorial is this cutout of a house with a window. You imagine the mom looking out or the dad looking out, waiting for their son or their daughter to come home. There are also a lot of Minnesota trees. There's this kind of calm body of water, just very gently bubbling. And so it's meant to be this very peaceful, anodyne kind of feeling. Okay, let's continue our conversation now about how Christians do history. Again, this will be a 2-week conversation because there's a lot for us to deal with here, and you'll be adding your own perspective in one of your essays for the course as well.
So, AnneMarie, let me go back to George Marsden. I've alluded to this book called The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. So let me read to you a little bit here, and I think this will pick up what we talked about the first segment, but then push it forward to ask what difference faith would make. So he says, in the corridors of the Pragmatic Academy, Christians and non-Christians can readily share basic standards of evidence and argument. I mean, as you said, in many respects, we play by the same rules. He says, the fact is, explicitly Christian convictions do not very often have substantial impact on the techniques used in academic detective work, which make up the bulk of the technical scientific side of academic inquiry. Christians, just as other scholars, must employ the requisite degree of detachment in order to weigh evidence judiciously, et cetera, et cetera. It might be objected, however, that if Christian scholarship involves anything that makes it distinctive beyond such technical knowledge, it will violate rules essential to the mainstream academy in just those respects. So I just want to kind of leave off there because that's something we'll come back to next week. There are ways you could do distinctively Christian history that would really make those rules difficult, and so we'll talk about providential history next week. Can you use, for example, special revelation as a source if you're a Christian historian? So I'll just plant that and we'll come back to it. Are there ways, though, that Christian faith or practice or religious imagination or participation in church can shape the way we do history that don't necessarily violate the rules of the secular academy? What difference could it make that maybe our non-Christian colleagues would not notice or maybe appreciate, actually, or to enrich our practice of the discipline?
I think one of the things that I was very much immersed in during my education as even a high school student and then again as a college student is this idea that everybody has a worldview. Some people have a Christian worldview, theoretically Christians have a Christian worldview, but even if you're not a Christian, you have a certain way that you see the world, and that's going to impact how you interpret this evidence and these secondary sources that you use. So I think there's a way that as Christians, our worldview impacts how we see that evidence and how we put it together, so that even if it is still playing by the rules and is still really good, legitimate history, it's okay to acknowledge that you, in fact, do see the world in a certain way, and that's impacted how you put that stuff together. So, I think I do not study prostitution and go, yes, women are experiencing the sexual revolution and making the most of it, and golly gee, that's fantastic. I really see this as, wow, this is a pretty cruddy situation, and a lot of people are implicated in what is happening, and I will be faithful to the women and say, here they are exerting agency, but the larger picture is one that I wish didn't exist.
I think, so to start with your first point is really important, which is it's not like Christians are the only ones who wrestle with this. I guess I would hope that secularist historians and Jewish historians, all are wrestling with the fact that there's no view from nowhere. I think here's where, I don't know, students, if you've encountered postmodernism yet, but the sense that all knowledge is embedded in something, that actually does matter.
And atheism is in itself a kind of religious viewpoint, even if it happens to contrast with a different Christian.
So, one thing Marsden is arguing for is the reason we play by the rules of the game, because to an extent that is sacrificing a way of doing history, is that it gains us admission to, he called it the pragmatic or the plural academy. He has this image from, I think, William James of it. It's like a hotel corridor. We all have our special rooms where maybe we talk differently, but in the corridor it's got to be a shared space. And so But in those rooms, we are reflecting on how our beliefs do shape us. And so in your case, history of prostitution does maybe lend you a different vantage point.
Right, and I don't want to cede the corridor or the rooms to just non-Christian historians who are comfortable, writing about the sort of darker side of sexuality. I want to be part of that conversation, and I don't want to just say, all right, this is somehow more polluted than something else, and therefore we can't touch it, and I'm just going to, do something else. I want to be part of that conversation as another way to maybe bring about a transformative influence.
Yeah, in the chapter students are reading from John Fia, he suggests that one way this might work out is that even within these rules, we keep talking about Christians proceed from certain theological assumptions, or Marsden, borrowing from Nick Wolterstorff, calls them control beliefs. And so one that I think you're kind of getting is the reality of sin, for example. Sophia writes about that. Another is the notion of the Imago Dei from Genesis 1:26-20. All humans are created in the image of God. Sophia has something to say about that. I know that's something you think about, and incarnation probably goes with that. What does that mean for you as a historian of sexuality, prostitution, the United States, or just broadly as a historian?
Well, I'd say, just to use the prostitution example again, I think sometimes, there's a tendency to sort of see prostitutes as so taboo and so off the radar that they don't actually fit into the Imago Dei. And I think it's really important to sort of say, yes, they are made in the image of God, and therefore they do need to have their respect. We need to respect these people. And I think a way to respect them is to understand what is going on and what makes them act the way they do, and understand that they are part of a connected human society. So yeah, I mean, even to tell their story. I mean, it's something we talked about maybe when we were doing primary sources. This is just the value of, this is what people have left behind, and to do it in a truthful, honest way, that actually is a way of recognizing maybe even that kind of deep sense of dignity and worth that comes from being created in the image of God.
If you're interested in war memorials, let me put a plug in for my class, History 231L, World War II. One of the things we do in that class, beyond talking about commemoration, is we actually visit these memorials and then some other World War I and World War II memorials around the Twin Cities. So you can look for that in even-numbered years. Not all of the memorials in the Capitol Mall are about wars or veterans. This is another of the memorials. There are those for firefighters, first responders, factory workers injured in their jobs. And then this one about the civil rights movement. This is the Roy Wilkins Memorial, called the Spiral for Justice. Roy Wilkins was one of the leaders of the NAACP from the mid-50s to the mid-1970s, a St. Paul journalist who is probably overshadowed by people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, some of the other heroes of that movement, but played a really important behind-the-scenes role and is a really heroic figure in St. Paul politics. So you can actually see a carving of Roy Wilkins on the other side of that wall. What's interesting about this memorial is that there are 46 different elements representing each of Roy Wilkins' 46 years of service to the civil rights movement. So mostly take this as an encouragement to come down and see the Capitol Mall yourself. We haven't even touched on all the statues of Minnesota politicians. The state capitol itself is really interesting. And just generally, remember that one of the goals of this class is to help us get a sense of how we're present and how location plays a really important role in how we understand what happens in history. We'll be back next week for another episode of Past and Present.
Back, baby, back in time.